All right, welcome back to the second AMR Roundtable on Overtures discussion for the PCA General Assembly in 2026 in Louisville, Kentucky. There's part one to this. So if you missed that, you want to go find a link on the AMR channel and watch that. But we're going to talk in this segment about deacons, about titles, ordination, officers, and then some of the other various miscellaneous overtures that have been sent up. So to get us started, we're gonna talk about Overture 37, which proposes allowing women to be ordained as deacons. So I don't remember what everyone said about this one. I'm sure not everyone is for this one. In fact, I might let Steve go first on this, and I know he opposes this. So let's go. Let's start with opposition to Overture 37.
Yeah. So I think what I want to say more broadly about all of these, and I think this is a good sort of segue into that, a couple of things. Our polity was more than sufficient for 50 years at least to demonstrate that we are a denomination that believes that God only calls men to the office of deacon. Um, Nothing has changed in our polity. We've always had that position from the beginning, and arguably you could say even before that, but certainly since the beginning of the PCA. And so, obviously, there have been some things that have been happening over the last couple of years, whether there have been things that have been brought to light or however you want to describe that, that suggest that there are those in the PCA that have different opinions, certainly, also those who have different practices, perhaps. Um, I, I'm opposed to this overture because I, I, I think it contradicts everything I believe about the office of deacon. That it is not open to women. That it is God who ordains or who calls gifts and equips the church with their deacons, and He does that through qualified men. And so, to have such a radical change, I think um, is certainly contrary to our understanding of what Scripture teaches. It's been contrary to our historical polity. Um, but I also part of this whole situation to me is that on the one hand, this is posed as a discussion about the role of women in ministry. For me, this is a theology proper question before it's an ecclesiological question. Um, because really what we're asking is sort of two different opinions. One that says God only uh, calls gifts and equips men to an office, and the other that says that God and calls gifts and equips men and women. Um, that's not really a statement about women. That's a statement about God, and God either does or does not. And if you're going to say He does, then every church that doesn't have women deacons is sinning against God. And if you're going to say that God only calls gifts and equips men, then we can't install a woman into that office. I also think to suggest in some way that God does or does not call a woman to the office of deacon depends in any way on the vote of a session or of a congregation is again a confusion about our understanding of God and His relationship to the church. So I think there are some that I want to refer back because I just want to say this is really we don't need this. It's not helpful. This is one that I want us to unanimously, if possible, say no to. I
Okay.
realize obviously it came from a presbytery, so there's going to be a handful of people who will vote yes, perhaps. Um, but I think even better than some of the other overtures, perhaps the best statement the assembly could make is an overwhelming no. This is not who we are as a denomination. It's not who we've been, et cetera. So that's
Okay.
sort of my, I would say, quick, but probably too late for that view on that issue and that overture in particular.
Yeah. Great, David.
The only thing I agree with that, and the only thing I would add is that I think even people in favor of women deacons ought to vote no on this question. the makers have a burden to offer persuasive material that would lead a person to think that God wants us to go in this direction from the scripture. It has almost no scriptural argument at all. The arguments are lists of scholars, historical persons, and historical practices in churches where women are ordained. And anybody could just as easily give a list of scholars, uh, historical leaders, and churches that think that's wrong. This overture does not deserve to pass because it doesn't come close to the burden that ought to be on an overture.
Howie, do you have anything to add to this?
Always, yeah. I'm not in favor of any of the 10 overtures that I consider in this category. I am fully convinced none of those 10 can get 58 presbyteries in favor. I know that's a utilitarian argument or a pragmatic argument, but why waste everybody's time? As I said earlier, or maybe in the prior taping, if you want something like this to pass, develop consensus outside of the assembly by persuading your brothers. And if it takes 5 years to do that, go ahead. To the question of, and I think maybe some of these overtures are trying to get to this, does God call, gift, and equip men and women for service? Well, in one sense, yes, not for office, but for service. My wife has done more mercy ministry than any human being in any church I've ever been in. She doesn't care what you call her. But what I'd like to see is a little bit of, in the PCA, toning down on the idea that if someone is in favor of ordaining women as deacons, which I'm not, it's somehow heretical when the ARP and the RPCNA are members in good standing in NAPARC and they ordain women deacons. So I think we need to turn down the heat a little bit, but no, I'm not in favor of this overture.
I'm going to avoid jumping in too much, but I will say one of the problems with the Overture 37 that's been raised is that it doesn't actually specify that it's the session that determines this. And so it actually could be read that all churches would have to ordain women. And even though the intention of the author was to make it so that the session would decide that, it wasn't clear, I believe, in the Overture itself. And so I think the author of that even was going to have to bring an amendment to Overtures Committee as well. So there's some challenges there. We'll talk about Overture 72, but I want to leapfrog because it's kind of related to this. Overture 74 does something different, which is it's calling for a new chapter that allows explicitly for commissioning non-ordained people. And so I wanted to hear if anybody had any thoughts on that. That's not the same, but obviously it's relevant to this issue. How do y'all feel about that one? Howie says send it back. David, what do you think?
I would actually like to have it referred to a study committee. And given the things I say about study committees, I need to call and rescue my reputation. I think study committees are good, but only in limited circumstances. And I think this is one of the limited circumstances. It's where the church knows that it has a question that is presently necessary to solve for the church's functioning.
Okay.
And if they know what the issues are and they say, this is what we want to hear about, and any recommendation with respect to how we can change or not change, I think that's what study committees are for. And I've served on a number of them that were of that character. I think that this overture quite thoughtfully raised questions that are broader than the diaconate question, having to do with the possibility of commissioning of non-ordained people. I've been in churches that have done commissionings of all kinds for all kinds of things. And I've never been confused as to whether that meant these people were deacons or elders or ministers. But so to me, there might be something to this. I'd like to have a committee look at the history of Reformed, especially American Presbyterianism, but other churches, And so, look, if there's any scripture warrant, for example, I think the commissioning of uh, of the people to go talk about the Acts 15 council, they weren't being ordained. Even the commissioning of Paul and Silas, when they first went out, they were both already ordained. There seems to be other sorts of commissioning, but maybe I'm wrong on that. But I'd like to see a very serious study of Scripture about that. I think the history of our Reformed usages, and that maybe there's something here that would be helpful in the midst of all of these discussions. So I've actually recommended that we send this to a study committee, and that there's another overture I'd like to see thrown into the mix, and I think it might be fruitful.
Okay, what's the other? Before I jump to Steve, what's the other overture that you wanted to send to a
I
study
was
committee?
afraid you were going to ask me that.
Okay, well, you think about it. Steve, let's jump over to you. What do you think about the 74 about commissioning not people in non-ordained ministry?
Yeah, well, I think that certainly this is something that has happened in many churches throughout the PCA. It's happened, the need for a chapter or a subchapter in the BCO. I think there's I think it could be helpful to a certain degree in establishing boundaries and guidelines. This is what it is. This is what it's not. This isn't one of the ones that rises to the top that I think is that important, so to speak. I'm intrigued. Anytime David says, "Let's send this to a study committee," I perk up because I've never heard that before in my life. I haven't been to PC all that long, but I've never heard that phrase before from him. But I just I think it's presented as a solution to a problem that may or may not even exist, so to speak. So I mean, I think that's one of the areas that's a little bit confusing. I was also turned off by the second whereas, where it talks about Paul and Barnabas being commissioned prior to their later appointment of elders in the churches. I'm not sure why those two sentences were placed together. Um, First of all, they were not appointed as elders in the churches. They were appointing elders in churches. So those two seem to be a non sequitur. I got stuck on that one. So, but beyond that, I don't think it rises to the level of uh, needing to change, or at least with everything else that's going on. But yeah, I'd love to hear more about a study committee and how that might be helpful for it.
Howie, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yes, I do. We had an SJC case years ago out of Rocky Mountain Presbytery where the SJC ruled that as long as you make it very clear that the person is not being ordained, in that particular case, you could use the word minister generically. We have had and will always have non-ordained church staff, non-ordained church volunteers, that it's good to sometimes set them apart, honor them, recognize them. But the idea that you would elect any of those people, to me, is, I think, extremely unwise and unnecessary. The idea that you would have them kneel in the front of the church and have hands laid on them for prayer, like you would with ordination, I think is unhelpful and unwise. Whether you use the verb commission or appoint or set apart or something like that, if commission makes my brothers really nervous, I'll find another verb. So I do think it's valid to find ways to honor, recognize, set apart in front of the church people that are non-ordained volunteers and church staff, but it can't look like ordination.
Yeah, I mean, I will say that to your point, Steve, about why is this needed? I mean, I think this year there's been a lot of things circulated about different practices of different churches that a lot of people are trying to say, well, what does this all mean? And I think this is an attempt to clarify what it could mean and what it shouldn't mean. So whether or not that's needed is another question, but I think that's the occasion in which this and several of the other overtures on this topic came up. I mean, there was a big firestorm online about that, and several presbyteries have received 40-5 complaints um, against individual sessions for various practices. So, David, were you going to say something else?
It's 52 is the other
Okay.
overture. And let me say, I agree entirely with Steve on his criticism about the commissioning and then appointing of elders. I don't know what those two sentences had to do with each other. Maybe they were asleep at the wheel, or but in any case, overall, the diaconal issue has spilt over into all kinds of wanting to make rules about what language you could use and what motions you might make, and I think it's getting out of hand. I am fully on board that. I'll make my confession. When I was ordained as a ruling elder, I took an exception to women not being allowed in the diaconate. I thought, from Warfield's influence and from, I almost thought Warfield couldn't be wrong. And I also thought that there was something to be said for the Phoebe thing. And I had no idea how women appear in the pastorals in the middle of that discussion of the diaconal office. But, and so I long held that. Um, uh, but later, when I was challenged more by it, about it by a friend, I went back and looked again, and I think, in fact, our Book of Church Order is wrong when it says that the diaconal office is not one of rule, but only of sympathy and service. I think the diaconal office is one of rule. It's rule, not like the elder with respect to the whole church, but it's rule with respect to a particular ministry. The 7 appointed in Acts were not appointed to feed the widows. They were appointed to make sure there was an equitable distribution of the things that went to the widows. That's a matter of judgment and rule. And when you look at our description of what the diaconal office is, there's authority attached to at least half of the things that it says deacons should be doing. A narrower kind of rule with respect to these things. And that's what changed my mind. I came to believe that what Paul says, I don't allow a woman to have authority over a man with respect to ecclesiastical things, is perfectly, in fact, consistent with what he has said in other places and how we ought to think about the diaconate. That's what changed my mind about women deacons. But having said that, I don't want the unusual zeal that now people seem to have about trying to crush the opposition on this subject. I like how he's turned down the heat a little bit, but now it seems to me this year, especially with a number of these overtures, to be spreading out to a kind of poison that if you say anything that sounds anything remotely like trying to identify some person as being useful in the service, one more thought and I'll shut up. New Hope, we teach our folk that the diaconal ministry belongs to the whole church. Every member has a responsibility with respect to caring for others. And in fact, it's the members who are the first line of diaconal ministry. They're the ones who ought to be caring for one another daily and evidencing the community of the saints. And the deacons are there when the task is greater than what one or two together on their own could do, when it needs organization, when it needs leadership. That's what the deacons are about. And so when you start talking about, like, there'd be something wrong with saying that non-ordained people shouldn't take up these offices in some way. And we're saying all it is that is helping other people. I think we're going to distort our ministries. So that's why I think it would be good to have such a study
So
committee.
for you, 74 and 52 should go to a study committee.
Yeah.
And Steve, were you going to follow up on David's comments there? No. Okay. I thought
No.
you might. I thought you had something to add there. Okay. Others in this bucket, I don't want to neglect Overture 72, which is requiring sessions to report elders and deacons in their minutes. Did anybody have any thoughts on that? It looks like you guys seem to all be in favor of this, or one of you said refer back. Howie, I
Yeah,
think
I
you said
think,
refer back.
yeah. I mean, I've been around long enough to be able to read between the lines, and this is basically, to me, a fishing expedition to find out which churches don't have diaconates. If you want to do that, make a BCO change that says you must have a diaconate, in which case you probably should specify what the quorum is, because a church could have a diaconate. There are churches with a diaconate of one person, right? So if you want to pass a law that says you must have a diaconate, and you don't specify that you must have 3, I see no other reason why Overture 72 was filed. Thank you.
Well, I think there's 2 reasons, and I get the undercurrent, whatever. So I think pragmatically, which is a word Howie loves, I do think there's a helpfulness to this, and even before we get to deacons, to know from a presbytery point of view where churches stand in terms of the number of elders that they have, because there have been certain circumstances in different presbyteries where we find out months later that a church is down to 1 elder or no elders. So in one sense, just having a list and to know, okay, this is a healthy church. They've got a good number of elders. I know that's not the only metric for healthiness, but I think there's a usefulness to that. The other thing about the deacons, and maybe this isn't the way to get around it or get to the issue, but something David had communicated earlier, and I'll let him talk more about it if he wants, but I think our polity is, again, clear enough that the only reason you should not have a deacons, or at least a deacon, is because you're willing to say God has not gifted us a deacon. That should be the only reason you don't have a deacon. Impossible should not mean it's impossible for us to have deacons because I want women to be deacons too, and so therefore we can't have any deacons. That's not. I realize that falls under the rubric of impossible the way it's written now, but if you take our polity as a whole, that cannot be what that means. And so whether or not this is the right way to get to it, I don't know. But I think that's it has been a paradigm shift in the PCA over, whether it's been over a decade or whatever, where the notion of impossible to have deacons has shifted from, I think, what it originally intended to say, to being more of a commentary on the office itself. And if a church, just like if a church doesn't have enough elders, if their church has no deacons or even only 1 deacon, they should be the ones fervently praying to God that he would pour out those gifts. And the elders should be doing everything they can to train up men to take on that role. And I'll say one more thing, going back to, Acts and sort of the establishment of this office. One of the things I tell my group of officer training is that as much as that section in Acts is about the establishment of a diaconate, it also says as much about the office of elder, that these are important matters that they hand to these men to deal with. But one of the main reasons why they hand those matters to them is so that they can focus on the ministry of the word and prayer. And so if the responsibilities of the diaconate are devolving to the session because it's impossible for them. They have to do all of those. And so that's how it was so important that the elders focus on the word and prayer, and that these very important mercy issues were handled authoritatively. I agree with David that Christ gives the church another office. So I think it's a shift, a paradigm shift that needs to go back the other way. And I don't know how to do that. Maybe an overture is the wrong way to do it, but I think there's some sort of way we need to get to that in our denomination.
I just want, at some point, I think the deacon issue is far less important than the elder issue. And I think the PCA believes that. We kicked the CRC out of NAPARC when they started ordaining women elders. At that time, the RPCNA and the ARP had ordained women deacons. We don't treat it the same way. I want someone to say, this diaconal issue is of paramount importance, and I think the ARP and the RPCNA should be booted out of NAPARC. That, to me, is consistent. If you're not going to say that, I don't think that you're being consistent. I'm not talking to anyone on this call. No. But I'm just saying it doesn't make sense to me otherwise.
Well, if I could just throw in I agree with Howie's suspicion of overtures like this. We've also had overtures like this before, where there was wanting to have various kinds of reporting that they were clearly looking for a way to get evidence. I don't think that's what's going on in 72, partly because I know Ascension Presbytery pretty well, and if this had come from another presbytery, I might be pretty confident of its character, but I doubt that from Ascension. And in the meantime, I think that Steve has mentioned some important areas where this kind of reporting would be valuable to have, regardless of what you think about our current controversies. And there are more, I think. And so I think it'd be a very good thing if we began to have this kind of reporting.
Okay. Somewhat related, Overture 61, declare the Danvers Statement to be biblically faithful. Howie, do you want to start and make a few comments about that?
Sure. I don't like declaring things. First of all, it's just what the majority of 2,000 guys in one city did in 1 year. It's not the PCA. It's the guys that showed up in a majority at that particular assembly. Secondly, there's a lot of words in the Danvers Statement, and it could be more biblically faithful if we tweaked it. Thirdly, it's a 38-year-old document, and it isn't written as well as it could be. It was at a particular cultural moment when radical feminism, I think, was more threatening than it is now. I know that some of our own scholars have critiqued Danvers. I know that Piper and Grudem both favor women deacons, and they were primary authors of Danvers. So I just don't think it's a wonderful statement. I think it could be improved, and I don't understand why we're being asked to declare it as biblically faithful. Is this supposedly a alternative to the diaconal overtures or something? I'm a little bit confused. So,
Okay. Anybody else have any thoughts on that? It didn't look like
Just
any of y'all
say-
supported that.
Well, I mean, I would probably, in one level, I mean, I don't think this is one that I would want to say no to. These are the kind of overtures, in a way, regardless of the content, that I don't like, because to say no to 61 will automatically go on, out into the Twitterverse as, PCA rejects Danvers statement and all that it says. And so, in that sense, I'm never really super happy about those, because you're sort of in trouble if you do to modify a statement, and in trouble if you don't. And so, in that sense, none of those really excite me terribly much. I do think that some of the principles that are enumerated in it are, thought to be. The argument is that these are principles. Let's begin with principles, and then we can go to the practical matters. And I- in in that sort of scheme, I'm 100% in favor of that. I always want to start with principles before I get to what we do. Um, so in that sense, I don't have a problem with the issue. I don't have a problem with Danvers' statement. I mean, Howie said it's 30 years old. Well, it's echoing biblical language that's 2,000 years old. So I mean, it's not the age of it; it's whether or not it is in fact biblically faithful. Um, so maybe we can postpone it indefinitely or something along those lines, so we don't actually have to do anything with it. Because again, I don't know that it's gonna. I don't think it would have a problem passing the assembly. I really don't. I mean, the Nashville statement really didn't either. There was a lot of debate and discussion over it. And I don't think the assembly is going to have a hard time declaring it biblically faithful. It's just a question of is that is that going to speak into the issue that's really before us? I think principally speaking, um, insofar as the Danvers statement is biblically faithful, we all already affirm it anyway. So in that sense, I understand the need for it. I understand the point. I'm always opposed to statements that if we say no to, it makes it sound like we hate something when we just didn't think it was. So all of those things wrapped up together, I'm not sure how to deal with it, but that's kind of where I'm at.
Howie, what about you?
Yeah, I think I heard a previous speaker say something about not knowing why it's needed. I don't know why it's needed. That's my point. When if I wrote an overture and someone said, "Why is this needed? What is he trying to accomplish here?" Um, but we don't have to answer it yes or no. Um, we could refer it back to presbytery or recommend the assembly postpone consideration indefinitely. Several years ago, I can't remember the city. There were competing overtures to memorialize one of our church leaders who had died, I'll say. And one was a complimentarily memorializing, and one was not complimentary. And so I took people out to dinner. I said, listen, we can't have this. We need to postpone consideration indefinitely of both of your overtures because this can't work. And that's what was done. And I think this is what we need to do on this one, too. So,
Well, I think we could deny the overture and say we deny because it's not the part of our church's calling to hear and endorse statements of other parts of the church or institutions. We have enough to do to care for our own house.
I like
Okay.
that, too.
I'd like to
Uh,
shut this down. No more Nashville, no more Danvers.
yeah. Yeah. We did that last year too. And yeah. Okay. So Westminster 31 is about elders distributing the Lord's Supper, only elders. All of you said no to this one, I think. It seems like
Yeah,
a
I think
repeat
this
from last
one's
year. Go
well,
ahead.
no, well, yes, but I think the easy answer is you got a directory of worship study committee.
Right.
It's
Yeah.
in that section of the book. Hear what they have to say, and
Right.
if it's being proposed for adoption, which I think it might be, send it down to get adopted, and then if it gets adopted, then you can make these proposals later to tweak it. But
Yeah.
to do
Yeah.
this precipitatively, um,
Yeah,
bad
that's
idea, I
what I
think.
thought. Okay, anything else related to deacons, officers, ordination, titling that you wanted to take up? I don't think any of you had identified any of the other ones related to this as something that you wanted to discuss. Okay. All right. Well, then let's just jump to talk about some of the miscellaneous overtures to kind of end this segment. There are a couple, I think three. Overture 66 from Philadelphia, one from Calvary 76, 89 from Fellowship that want to give thanks for the 250th anniversary of our nation's founding. Do you all have any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I thought I think it's a great idea. Uh, I realized that some of the wording might be a little heavy to get past. I think one of them said basically all of these whereas statements we're adopting more or less, and that's always a bad idea. But we certainly believe in a God of providence and a God who raises up nations and casts them down, for that matter. And in God's kindness and providence, He has kept our nation whole and together for 250 years. Um, there is not another nation on earth or in history that I would rather live in than the one that I live in now. And I thank God for that. I thank God for the freedoms that we have here in this country, the freedom of religion that we have. And it's not a perfect country. There's lots of things I'm sure all four of us could list that we would love to see changed. But I think thanking God for that, for what we have, is always a good thing. And so at 250 is certainly a monumental year. Um, I think it's a good thing. The exact language might need to be tweaked and changed, and maybe saying less is better than saying more. Um, Perhaps given the study committee on Christian nationalism, there's an overtone or an undertone perhaps to all of this, but
Yeah.
I don't think there needs to be. I pray every Sunday for the civil magistrate, try without fail, um, regardless of who's in office, state, national, and local level, because God calls us to. I think giving thanks is a good thing. So, yeah, I'm in favor of it. But the idea, if not necessarily the details.
Yeah. Howie?
Yeah, I'm very much in favor of giving thanks. I mean, I spent 8 years in the Air Force. I'm pretty fond of America. I think we can do that in I think we can do that in one sentence. We don't have to drag in anything else. I was a little bit concerned about the phrase countenanced and maintained by the civil magistrates, one of the confessional differences I've expressed to every session I've ever been on. I'm pretty sure I don't think that the same way as they did in 1647. Maybe the Americans' understanding of countenance and maintained by the civil magistrates different than it was in London way back then, but I don't agree with what I understand them to have believed. So I didn't want to see that language in there. I think we can adopt one sentence and genuinely be thankful for God's providence in this country, for sure.
David, do you have anything to add?
Well, yeah, no, not really.
Okay.
I don't. I wish it hadn't been as long as this, because it just opens up.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, I was expecting it to be far more flag waving in unwholesome sense than it is. I thought it was pretty tame for. But I agree with Howie that citing the larger catechism in this context, in the way they cite it, it seems to me to be a mistake. And it either ought to be stricken, or, I mean, the way I would have put it is that that the church may be countenanced and maintained by the civil magistrate, meaning countenanced and maintained as any other institution of social well-being. I think that's what the Americans meant. It's the only thing that's consistent with the amendments that were made in 1789 to the Confession of Faith. I think they decided not to change the Shorter Catechism because this was a perfectly fair reading of it, and it ought to be read that way in the new context that the amendments made. But I think we need to draw attention to that. We can't just, especially in this context today,
Right.
we can't.
Or it
Yeah,
could have been that they were like us, and sometimes we change something, not realizing we should have changed something else at the same time.
That could be. That could be.
Well, it certainly is a complicated year for it to be the 250th anniversary and for us to be talking about establishment and Christian nationalism and all that. So,
Right.
in a year when we need to move quickly, it's kind of unfortunate that there's these little potential hiccups on something that I think everyone would agree with, which is being thankful for God's kindness to our country. So,
Yeah.
all right, well, let's talk about the one overture from last year that was pushed forward, the 2025 Overture 49 from Pacific Northwest, ad interim study committee on artificial intelligence. Howie, do you want to speak to that first?
Yeah, I was not at the Presbyterian meeting where that was proposed, so I wasn't privy to the debate. I've got two sons that work in AI. I don't know what they're talking about when they talk to each other. I went to see a documentary called The AI Doc, and the first half of it scared me to death, and the second half of it made me very excited. So it is a huge thing. Some of the people in AI liken it to the discovery of fire and how that will change the world. So I don't argue that it's not important. I can't argue that it's not important. But my sons also say that these AI companies are leapfrogging each other every 2 weeks. So a study committee report's going to be outdated by the time it comes out. But I'm not opposed to it for sure because it is a hugely important topic. And it can be important to the church as well.
Okay,
And
so
maybe
you
that's what
sound
the
a little
study
bit
committee,
yeah, you sound a little indifferent. You're not really sure yes or no on that one.
because I'm not intelligent.
Okay.
Artificial or otherwise.
Yeah, right. Steve, what do you think about this? Do you think we should have a study committee on
So,
artificial intelligence?
yeah, I think it could be very helpful, and a couple of reasons. I mean, one, obviously, if the study committee comes back and says, pastors and students using AI to write their sermons or their papers is bad, well, everybody should already know that
Right.
already. I do think that there are some kind of broader pastoral concerns related to especially younger people and their engagement of it. In much the same way that it might have been helpful 10 years ago if we had a study committee on maybe social media
Mm.
that again, not good or bad, but providing pastoral resources for people to deal with the epidemic of that has infected our church. And to the point where I don't even get on Twitter anymore, hardly ever get on Facebook because of the nature of the conversation. Obviously that's a totally different discussion, but back to AI, um, I think having some wiser guys, and when I say wiser, probably they will have a full head of hair and none of it will be gray. But they're wiser on these matters because they deal with it and know some of the the pits that we might fall into. They obviously can't get them all, but to provide some resources and just even if it's just awareness to the church more broadly about the dangers that are involved in this, far outside of plagiarism, I think could be helpful. It could also be so milk toast that we all look at it and say, "Well, I could have written that." But I've also found while I don't think I've ever voted in favor of a single study committee, except maybe one or two, but beyond that, I'm always pleasantly surprised at how well they end up coming out. Even ones that I was like, "Oh, please, let's not do this." By the time you get it and read it, you're like, actually, this is really good. Uh, Maybe not 100%, but 95 is not bad, for what we're doing. So I think in that sense, it could be helpful. So it all just depends on obviously who gets on it, what their parameters are, but I think it could be helpful.
All right, David, last word on this one.
Well, I I think I've had all the words that I should offer on it. I'm just against study committees unless they're for a distinct purpose that needs to be accomplished by the church, and the church needs to be guided by it. I
Okay.
think that in general I'll put it this way, the best resources for our folk are not assembly study committees, but the intellectual and spiritual wealth we have in our ministers, teachers, and scholars through academic institutions, conferences, publications, broadcasts, recordings, journals, and magazines.
Okay, so you're also then opposed to the other study committee, which is Overture 80 from Calvary on CT and CRT. And you said
Absolutely.
even with prejudice, like it was out of order. So tell us more about that.
Well, I just say that one of the whereases uh, refers to, not by name, but refers to leaders in the PCA who hold to critical race theory. and it's footnoted. It's footnoted to the Vanguard Presbytery website, an article by Dewey Roberts, who names them, and it's highly critical of them. Now, I think that violates Robert's rules. I don't think we can have a debate where somebody in the debate makes allegations about a brother in the PCA. And that's what the whereases are. It's debate. So I'm thinking seriously about asking at least that whereas to be ruled out of order. But I mean, I take it you've all had a chance to read it. They wrote the study report they wanted already in the whereases. That thing is a laying out of everything that they think is terrible about critical race theory, most of which I agree with. But I think it's an abuse of an overture. If it gets voted down, they will have already succeeded in what they wanted, was to get that message out, because everybody in the assembly should have read it. Well,
all right, Howie, what do you think?
Yeah, no, I agree with David. I mean, if someone has a position on something, don't make an overture to form a study committee. Write the paper yourself. We didn't ask in Pacific Northwest for a study committee on voting age restrictions for minor communicants. We wrote a 20-page rationale and attached it to the overture. Do it that way.
Steve, what do you think about this?
Well, unfortunately, I did not get an opportunity to read Overture 80, given how recent it came out and its length. So I can't speak intelligently to that. I did see what David had pointed out in earlier communications and when it saw what he was talking about, and I agree with what he said. Like, do I think that CT and CRT are bad things and shouldn't be in the PCA or in the church broadly? Yes. Again, I'm not so sure that a study committee is going to fix that, so to speak. And at the end of the day, this is very different from the Christian National study committees, where there were a number of presbyteries that were saying, this is a difficult issue. We're dealing with some problems. Can you please, basically sort of a Macedonian call, right? Can you brothers help us out? We're not really sure. We would love to get broader wisdom on the PCA on this issue. I know that there were some who were favorable of some of the Christian nationalism, or at least some things that are in that orbit that thought of it as all they're asking for is the ammunition they need to go file charges against people. But I mean, a study committee can't really be introduced as evidence in an ecclesiastical trial anyway. If you can't establish it from scripture and the confession, then I mean the study committee might add, all it's going to do is add more paper to the record of the case that eventually has to get read by the SJC. So if someone thinks that CT or CRT is outside of the bounds of the PCA, then again, back to what David said a long time ago, well, you go and you talk to them, and if you can't come to an agreement, then there's mechanisms for dealing with issues that you think are contrary to scripture. So in that sense, I'm not sure how important or necessary it is. Much like Howie, this was back when I was in Ascension, and echo David's comments on the character of that presbytery. But we were concerned about the book Still Time to Care, I think it is. We established a presbytery level study committee that read it and commented on it and was distributed to our presbytery. There were a number of churches that were dealing with some issues that we thought it would be helpful for them. There's nothing that says this has to come from the denomination, and particularly when the whereases, which to be fair I have not read, are most of the first five pages. It seems as though they already done plenty of research on whether or not this is good or bad. So from that perspective, I'm not terribly in favor of it. But we'll see. We'll see how it goes.
All right. Well,
And
gentlemen,
I wanted to clarify, I wasn't impugning Ascension Presbytery.
No,
But
David was
every
defending
pre-
Ascension Presbytery.
every
That's all I was.
every presbytery clerk should know who the ruling elders are, and all he has to do is send an email to the session clerk and say, "Hey, who are your ruling elders?" There's a whereas clause in there that references this was attempted last year via an RAO change. That RAO change proposal failed, so we're going to try it by BCO. And so that's where my comments come from. So, but no, I was in Ascension
So
Presbytery
that's back to
at one
Overture
time.
72. Yeah, sorry.
Oh,
Okay, well, I think
right.
we've tackled this these two buckets pretty well, and so I think we're going to wrap up this second part. So thank you guys for taking the time, and for those watching, we're going to have one more part that deals with judicial matters and polity matters. So we hope that you'll tune in for that. Thanks.